You are listening to When Life Gives You Lemons, the podcast that speaks to high-performing individuals who have been through adversity but come back stronger. I'm your host, Emma Levy, a physiotherapist who has helped elite athletes on their way to Olympic success. This podcast was born following my own trauma when I was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of just 36. Sat in the chemo chair, I set myself the goal of starting a podcast to explore resilience and the importance of mindset. I just want to take a quick moment to thank you for listening and ask you to please press the follow button. Remember, you can catch all of our episodes on YouTube and follow us on Instagram at Life Lemons Podcast. Today, I'm welcoming Felicity Ashley to the podcast. Felicity has a remarkable story. A few years ago, alongside 3 other working mums, she completed the world's toughest row, a 3,000-mile unsupported row across the Atlantic Ocean. In completing it, she joined the ranks of only 280 women to have ever rowed an ocean. Her aim was to inspire and show that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Then, just weeks after arriving home following this incredible achievement, she was diagnosed with stage 3 bowel cancer, a challenge which would once again put her mental and physical resilience to the test. Felicity, thanks for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
What a journey you've been on.
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster.
This all happened 2021, 2022, when you had very young children at home, is that right?
Yeah, my children were 4, 6 and 8 when we set off on the row. In fact, it pretty much to the day, 3 years ago to the day, that this year's race starts today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So I've got to ask you, what was your husband's response when you told him that you had this idea?
Do you know what? It's brilliant, and I talk about this quite a lot when I speak. I asked him, look, I said, Pip's asked if I want to row the Atlantic, kind of waiting for this prolonged conversation drawn out over several weeks. And he said, well, look, it can either be a short conversation or a long one, so let's make it a short one. I think he genuinely wasn't prepared to have a year-long battle over whether I do it or don't do it. And I think he could tell by, my reaction that it was something I really wanted to do.
Were you a rower?
Yes and no. I had rowed at school to a reasonable level. I represented Wales. Not that that's a major achievement at school, but I had rowed at school for 2 or 3 years, but not since. So, I'd had 3 decades pretty much of not rowing.
So how did it actually come about?
Well, my brother-in-law, David, my sister's husband, rowed the Atlantic 2 years before us. And it had been a lifelong dream for him to row the Atlantic. He'd read a book about it when he was 7. And from then on, it was kind of on his bucket list. And sure enough, he achieved it 2 years before we did it. And it was when my sister was in Antigua to see him finish that somebody said to her, the person that owned the boat, look, if another crew wants to use the boat, then I'll keep it on. At which point my sister put her hand in the air and said, I'll do it. And then she came home and called me. So we were incredibly fortunate to effectively be gifted a boat, because that's a major hurdle to doing something like that.
Yeah.
So Pip wrote me in, and then we had the job of finding 2 more women who were willing and able to do it.
But you weren't just a working mum. You'd also just had a hip replacement.
Yeah. Yeah, and when Pip initially said, do you want to row the Atlantic? I've got a boat. I said, of course I can't. I've just had a hip replacement and the kids are too young. But really, I think that was me almost trying to protect myself from disappointment if I couldn't do it for some reason. But actually, the hip replacement was the enabler for the whole thing, because there's no way I could have contemplated doing it a year before when I had so much pain from the hip and, really lacked mobility. But, 2 or 3 months previously, I'd had my hip done. I was no longer in pain. I had full range of movement again, and I was, getting on really well with my rehab. So really, it wasn't an excuse to say no. It was actually a reason to say yes.
And you were a fit person?
Yeah, I've always been pretty fit. I rowed at school, and then I kept reasonably fit through uni, not through any kind of team sport, just through being active. And then in my 20s and 30s, did quite a lot of kind of triathlons, a few slightly longer things, a quadrathlon, half Ironman. I mean, nothing ever on the scale of the row, but I dabbled in what I now call kind of mini endurance events. And I had managed to keep that up despite needing a hip replacement. I was still running at the time. Towards the period of the operation, I kind of reduced it down to cross training because that was pretty much all I could do. But fitness has always been part of my life. So I suppose I had a good base to start from.
Because it's not an easy ordeal to train for something like that, is it?
No, we were training 6 days a week, sometimes twice a day. The longest probably session was a couple of hours, so 2 hours on the rowing machine, on the erg. Otherwise, there would be kind of weights, strength and conditioning type things.
That
Pilates.
sounds so boring. 2 hours on the erg.
Well, actually, I really enjoyed my 2 hour sessions because I had a contraption on my rowing machine where I could fix my iPad and I'd watch a film. And when you've got 3 young children, your opportunity to have any kind of me time and watch a film is so limited that it was a joy. I'd do it early on a Saturday morning, so get up at something like 5:30, 6, and do it pretty much before the kids were even up and about having breakfast. And I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, amazing. So how were those 40 days, 11 hours and 25 minutes out at sea?
Incredible. I mean, it really was the most extraordinary and brilliant experience of my life. I loved every single second of it. Yes, it was hard. It was mentally and physically extremely tough, but we knew it was going to be. It wouldn't have been the challenge it was if it hadn't been tough. And we trained and prepared, both mentally and physically for those things. And it was just wonderful. It was such a very different experience compared to normal life. Ordinarily, as a working mum of 3, we were juggling so many different balls. And it was COVID as well at the time. So, we were, in and out of homeschooling, which was a nightmare. And the simplicity of life at sea, it was just eat, sleep, row, repeat for 40 days. For many people that sounds utterly boring, but actually it was bliss. When as a mum of young children, do you get that time to just be, just think, just do nothing, and it was a joy.
And it was for 40 days, literally 2 hours rowing, 2 hours off, continuously?
Yeah. On the whole, the standard shift pattern for a crew of 4 is 2 hours on, 2 hours off, rowing in pairs. But for a good chunk of the race, during the daylight hours, we rowed 3 up, which is 3 people rowing at any one time. And then in the daytime, we then reduced our rest time down to an hour. So for quite a lot of it, we were kind of rowing for 14 or 16 hours a day each. And that obviously then ate into our rest time. So it was a lot of rowing, yeah.
Physically... Yeah. How does that compare to like a 2 hour on the erg? Is it as hard? Is it harder?
No, it's not as hard. You couldn't sustain 16 hours of rowing on an erg for 40 days. But it's very changeable depending on the sea conditions. So actually the first 2 or 3 weeks of the race were pretty calm, pretty flat. But that was the hardest in many ways because it was like rowing through treacle, and it was literally like every stroke was like weightlifting, and that was quite demoralising because it felt like we were making slow progress. Whereas when the weather picked up and the sea state changed, and we had the big waves and the wind, it was a lot easier and you were going much faster. So it was almost, the opposite happened when the weather got worse. It actually became easier in some ways to row. There were then occasions when it did get really difficult again, and a couple of times the steering got knocked off course, and we then had to try and turn, the boat started turning in the wrong direction, and then we had to kind of haul it round. And again, that was literally like lifting massive weights all on the oars, trying to turn this machine round.
And were there any scary moments?
Yeah, there were. There were, we had 3 or 4 nights when the seas were huge. I don't know how big the waves were, but probably 30 foot, 40 foot possibly.
So coming over you? Or
sometimes coming over you. And what was the scary points were when there wasn't a moon out and you couldn't see anything. And so you had no idea when the next wave was going to hit. So you're kind of straining your eyes and your ears, desperately trying to see something or hear something. And then you suddenly get this whoosh as a wave kind of, crashes over the top of you. And if you were in the cabin at the time, you'd hear a kind of a scream from deck and you thought, there's another wave. Oh. And so, on those nights, it was a bit like being on a white knuckle ride. Or sometimes I describe it as being, as you imagine being on a magic carpet. You are literally, you don't know which way you're going to tip next, whether it's going to be forward or back or side to side. And you're gripping onto the oars and it's scary stuff.
And 4 of you in very tight conditions for such a long period of time. Did you all get on the whole time? Were there arguments?
On the whole, we got on brilliantly. I was with my sister and then two others, Lebby and Jo. We had a team mantra, which was stay safe, stay strong and stay friends, because for us, staying friends was so important. We didn't want to do this at the expense of friendships, certainly not in my case at the expense of a sibling, sibling relationship. And that kind of guided all of our decision making and how we did everything on the boat. And, it helped when there were occasions when there was sort of conflict, because that was so important to us. We had to get kind of through those things. There were a couple of occasions when there were a couple of arguments on the boat, never between my sister and I, but they were in response to, physical extremes when people, emotions just boiled over. And, to their credit, they got over them very, very quickly. And we're still great friends now. We meet up every year. In fact, we just had a meet up this weekend because it's the annual kind of mothership, which was the name of our crew, our mothership AGM. We have such a special bond now, having shared those 40 days together.
Yeah, so overall, quite a life-changing experience, I imagine.
Yeah.
And then you come home from that incredible high to very soon after receive a cancer diagnosis.
Yeah.
So from the highs of the highs to the lows of the lows. For the sake of awareness and the importance of early detection, can you tell us what your signs and symptoms were for your cancer and how you got diagnosed?
Yeah, so looking back, I had the original signs on the row, and on a boat, rowers use a bucket as a toilet.
Lovely.
It's very nice. There's a technique called bucket and chuck it, which you really do need to master. And for some reason, during the second half of the race, during night shifts, I'd get an urgent, I'd need to go to the loo and use the bucket. But we had an unwritten rule that you shouldn't really stop your shift to go for a poo. You could do it for a wee because that was, a 30-second job, but otherwise you'd hold it in and you'd wait until you were off shift. But I got this cramp in my tummy and just felt like I really needed to go. So I would wait until my sister came on shift and then say, I'm really sorry, Pip, I just need to use the bucket. But we thought nothing of it because everything about what we were doing was strange. The food that we were eating, the ordeal that we're putting our bodies through. So there was every reason to justify that change in bowel habits as being down to what we were doing. And it was really only when I came home that didn't settle down that I started wondering if there was anything, more sinister going on. And over the next few weeks, the kind of cramping got worse, and then I started needing the loo more often until I then started noticing blood in my poo as well. And that was kind of a clear sign for me that something wasn't quite right. So I went to the GP, but my dad had IBS. And so I kind of thought there was probably something going on with my bowels, but it was probably some kind of condition similar to Dad's. And that's what the GP thought too. All along, it was we just need to rule cancer out. So they did the various tests, and I went for my colonoscopy. And even prepping for the colonoscopy, the nurse said, "Don't worry, you'll be fine. We just need to rule it out."
Yeah.
And then midway through the colonoscopy, I just remember there was a trainee doing it to start with, and then at some point I became aware that the trainee was no longer doing the procedure, and the main man had taken over. And in a colonoscopy, you are looking at a plasma screen because that's how the colonoscopist or endoscopist can work his way around. And I remember him saying to the nurse, "Is she awake?" And then to me, "Are you awake? Are you awake? Can you see that?" And I was kind of just coming round from gas and air. Yeah, but you don't know what you're looking at because I've never seen the inside of my bowels before. And he said, "That's a tumour, you've got cancer."
What? Surely that's
quite
not
brutal.
appropriate.
I don't know.
What a strange way to break the news to you.
Yeah, it was quite brutal. There was no... Yeah.
Because you were obviously sedated.
No, I wasn't actually.
Oh, you did that without sedation?
No, I did it without sedation because it coincided with the day of our rowing awards evening in London. And if you have sedation, you can't drink and you can't drive. And I needed to be able to drive to get to Jo's house to go to the awards do. So I decided in the end that I would take the hit and not have sedation. So I had gas and air. It was pretty uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah. Did you go to the awards do?
I did. I thought I wouldn't at the time. But after the procedure, one of the nurses looked at my beautifully painted toenails and said, "Oh, they're lovely. What's that for?" And I said, "Oh, I was supposed to be going to the Rowing Awards dinner tonight." She said, well, go. She said, nothing has changed. Physically, nothing has changed, since walking through the door this morning. So go, enjoy it, and then deal with this tomorrow. And I actually thought she's right, because it wasn't something I could do on any other day or any other time. I had this, it was only happening that night. And I thought, in all likelihood, cancer is going to stop me doing things in the future, but it doesn't have to take this away from me now. So I did go, put on my glad rags, and I went.
Oh, God. Probably put it to the back of your mind, didn't you, for those few hours, and then just dealt with it the day after. Yeah. And then you needed surgery?
Surgery, yeah. So 3 weeks later I had surgery. So it's a bowel resection. So it's about 7 hours of surgery, removing, I think it was an 11 centimetre length of my bowel. And then it was after the surgery when they did the biopsy. They'd harvested, my surgeon had harvested lymph nodes as well. And it was when they had the results of the biopsy on the lymph nodes that they found cancer cells in some of the lymph nodes. So that's what then dictated that it was stage 3 cancer. And then I went on to have chemo after that. So about 4 months of chemo.
Oh, wow. So literally going from, being the fittest you've been to being on a chemo ward.
Yeah.
Did you continue to exercise throughout?
I did, and I think that's what got me through it. The advice after my surgery for abdominal surgery like that is to aim to walk for about 45 minutes within 6 weeks. But I'd been fit going into it, and I was kind of marching around for 90 minutes by about the 2-week point. And it's not because I was out to prove the doctors wrong or, because I'm a superhero or anything. It was just, I was a mum. I had 3 small children. I needed to get back and home for my kids. But also being able to do that gave me such mental strength as well. There was that psychological impact of being able to walk around, kept me feeling positive. But also I thought, well, if I can still do this, if my body's still fit enough to walk for 90 minutes, then surely I'm going to be okay. So it really did keep me going. And it was also my way of maintaining some kind of control. There was so much about the whole situation that was out of my control, but I could still control that bit of it and my exercise. And it was clinging to some kind of part of normality, I suppose, in this strange world I found myself in.
Yeah, our stories really are very similar, because I always harp on about the importance of exercise for me during my treatment. And I always say that about the control. It's, the one thing that you can do that no one's telling you to do and that you can take full control of, and you just do what you feel like doing on that day.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you feel like you as well, which is important.
100%. And, there were days, especially during chemo, you'll know the effects of chemo. You're absolutely exhausted. There were days when it was pretty much all I could do to crawl to my bed after tucking the kids into theirs. But on the whole, when I could, I carried on. There were things I couldn't do. I had a PICC line in my arm, which meant that I couldn't kind of do weights because I couldn't lean down particularly, but I could run and I could walk. Yeah. So I adapted my exercise regime to accommodate the chemo, and as much as I could, I kept going. Yeah. And it was so beneficial to me in all ways, because, keeping physically fit and strong gives your body a better chance of fighting the cancer and coping with the chemo. But it was also that mental benefit as well.
Oh, yeah. I remember giving my friends real shocks when I was going for runs with them, and then getting home and having these massive vertigo attacks, nosebleeds. And they were like, what are you doing? I was like, it's fine. I'll be fine.
Yeah, I remember I was in Cornwall on holiday with my family just after my first round of chemo, and I had a check-in with a phone call check-in with the consultant afterwards to see how I was feeling after my first round, because one of the side effects of chemo, as you probably know, is you can get there can be issues with heart problems. And she said, how are you feeling? And I said, well, I get a bit tight-chested running. She said, running? She said, most people don't run. I said, well, I get a bit tight-chested when I do. She said, we better change your medication then. So then they switched my drugs.
That's lucky.
Yeah. But I think just most people don't. Most people see it, as an excuse to stop doing things like that. Whereas for me, it was, back to my reasons. It was a reason to keep going and carry on.
I think they've started putting exercise bikes on chemo wards now. Have you heard about this?
No.
Yeah, so now there's some research looking into the effects of actually cycling during chemo, which is quite fascinating. Yeah. So I think the psychology is changing around exercise during chemo, and the research is coming out supporting it.
Yeah.
So it's great.
I mean, that makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
And it's also something to take your mind off. You know, if you're sat in a chemo ward, there's not a lot to do, is there? Something to take your mind off watching this poison drip into your arm.
Yeah. Well, that's when I found podcasts.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of my podcast journey. Do you think that the physical and the mental strength that you gained from the row helped to prepare you for your cancer journey?
100%. Yeah. Because I knew that I was physically and mentally bulletproof. You know, something like the row is arguably more a test of mental strength than physical strength, but it absolutely tests both. And it was such a good foundation going into something like cancer, because I thought, I've rowed the Atlantic, I've done something that, you know, fewer than 280 women in the world have ever done. More people have been to, climbed Everest than rowed an ocean. If I can do that, then I can get through this. It just gave me that confidence and that inner belief that I had the resilience to get through it.
Before you rowed the Atlantic, did you have as much confidence in yourself physically and emotionally?
I wouldn't say I had as much, but I was pretty sure of my, I suppose, mental and physical resilience. And partly that stemmed from my hip replacement, because when I went in to see the surgeon for the first time after I'd had an MRI and various scans, he said, well, your hip's 100% screwed. He said, there's nothing more you can do to damage it anymore.
Another blunt surgeon.
Absolutely. But I think he probably knew his audience. He said, most people couldn't even walk with a hip in your condition, but you can still run. I don't understand it. And I honestly remember driving away from my hospital appointment that day, just feeling really uplifted. And I thought it was really odd. But when I reflected on it, I realised what he'd said to me about still being able to run when most people couldn't even walk, I'd interpreted as, that means I'm nails. I must be tough as old boots. And that kind of label of being nails, which I now call my superpower, is something that I then sort of took through everything. And so it's partly the reason I agreed to do the row, is because I thought, I'm nails. Of course I can do this. And again, it carried me through the cancer diagnosis as well, because this funny belief coming from my surgeon that, you know, I can do things that most people couldn't.
2 years post-cancer, I think 2 years?
2 years post-treatment.
2 years post-treatment.
Yeah.
Are you well now?
Touch wood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Until someone tells me otherwise, I'm well. I'm in a period of being monitored for 5 years, and I'm 2 years through that period. My oncologist said have a big party at 3 years and an even bigger party at 5. So,
Okay.
you know, I'm not sure I'll ever get the all clear. I don't know that even exists anymore. But I feel, back to full physical health and just being, you know, monitored regularly.
Yeah. And do you think about the risk of recurrence a lot?
No. No, I have a 27% chance of recurrence, which isn't insignificant, but I see it the other way. I think, well, I've got a 73% chance of staying healthy. And I also think there's no point in dwelling on the what ifs. I could stop living life for 5 years, but that's not going to do me any good. So I'll carry on and live life. And if I have to stop and adjust things because there is a recurrence, then so be it. I'll deal with that when it comes. But I'm not going to let it stop me living my life for the next 5 years.
And do you think you've changed post-cancer as a person?
Yeah, I do. I wouldn't say dramatically, but it definitely changes your perspective on life, makes you reassess things, I think. I've definitely learnt to live with more intention and I suppose in tune with my purpose. I think I've found a different purpose through it, because you spend so much of your life working, and if it's not in tune with who you are and it doesn't light you up, then you're kind of wasting life. So it's definitely taught me to, it may be a cliche, but live every day like it's my last, because you never know what's around the corner. You might be run over by a bus the next day. You know, in my case, I wasn't expecting a cancer diagnosis, but it happened. So nobody knows what's around the corner, and so you just have to take the opportunities that come along and make your opportunities as well.
Yeah, I really agree. It's, you know, the way I've changed is I try and be a lot more present.
Yeah.
I used to set these crazy long-term goals, you know, like in 10 years' time, I want to be doing this. And I've really stopped now making those long-term goals. And I just try and set myself mini goals as I go along. And then you achieve them, you know, and you can tick it off and say, well, I've achieved that. I can now decide what I want to do today.
Yeah.
Rather than 5-10 years later, because like you said, we just don't know. We don't know what's coming.
No. And I've also learnt, you know, a bit like setting those small goals, just to appreciate the things that really do matter in life. And it's often the really small things. So, for example, just a morning coffee with my husband when we're both at home. That's such a joy. And it's just those small things that really do matter.
Yeah.
Or reading the kids a story at night. You know, I do try and be present. I'm probably still work in progress sometimes.
As are we all.
Yeah. But,
I try to be.
Yep. There are so many distractions out there that take you away from doing that. But I certainly try as well.
My best friend told me recently I need to start mindfulness. So I'm going, that might be a New Year's resolution.
Yeah, there's different ways of doing mindfulness though, aren't there? It doesn't necessarily mean sitting on a sofa.
Well, exactly. I say that my mindfulness is in running and swimming.
Yeah.
Because that for me is like my meditation and my mindfulness. But sometimes I do wonder if that's a bit cheating and I need to take some actual stillness.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I need to actually stop.
Yeah.
Because I don't stop a lot.
Yeah.
So
I'm not very good at that either.
Watch this space.
No, so I'm liable to think, well, my exercise is my mindfulness.
Yeah.
But you might be right. It might be slightly cheating.
I'm not sure. So I believe you were in corporate marketing a while back. But now you primarily do, we haven't spoken about this, but you primarily do motivational speaking.
Yes.
So that was a bit of a change of career midlife. What was the drive for the change?
It was really the combination of the row and then the cancer. And the cancer was the real catalyst. I remember waking up from my surgery and just feeling compelled to share a photo of me on social media with tubes up my mouth looking horrendous, alongside a picture of me just a few weeks earlier finishing the row and, you know, being on top of the world, fitter than I'd ever been. Because the juxtaposition of those two things was so stark. And I just wanted to share that message that it can happen to anyone at any point in their lives. And although I don't want to be a prophet of doom, don't run the risk of thinking it's not going to happen to you, because it might. And I just really wanted to raise awareness of that point, partly because I was aware of the symptoms of bowel cancer because of another rower who rowed our race, who was rowing in memory of his wife. So it's Ed was rowing in memory of his wife, Anna, who died of bowel cancer in her mid-30s. And he used to post frequently about the signs and symptoms. And although at the time I had no reason to kind of particularly take it on board, it had sunk in, which is why I recognised my symptoms as being bowel cancer symptoms and was able to go to the GP and get it checked out. Yeah. Because as you say, that early diagnosis is absolutely critical to better patient outcomes.
It's just life-changing, isn't it? Those few months can literally save your life.
Yeah, 100%. And so I felt compelled to share my story in that way. And then my work situation changed, and that kind of then gave me the opportunity to rethink what next. And it was a combination of lots of different conversations happening with different people, including a coach, which all came back to my story and have you thought about sharing it? And that was really what prompted me to change tack and do a bit of a career pivot and start motivational speaking, to share my story, but more around the lessons that I've learned so that I can help other people and, you know, from a workplace perspective, help address some of the kind of frequent common challenges in the workplace, whether it's how you build high-performing teams or how do you overcome challenges or gear up for massive goals. So there's lots of ways that my story can relate back to workplace challenges.
How have you found the pivot of career? Have you found that you've had restrictions from people around you, or has everyone been quite supportive and that you wanted to change career?
I think everyone's been really supportive. Yeah, I mean, it helps that I was sort of quite determined about it. And my attitude to most things in life is all in. You know, I'm either doing it or I'm not doing it. And some people said, well, have you thought about doing some marketing consultancy on the side whilst doing this? And I thought, no, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to throw myself into it with both feet and be all in. And yeah, that's been my approach. And it is hard work. It's hard work setting up your own business, as you know, when you've been used to, you know, a regular salary coming in, and that's all I'd known. So being self-employed and setting up my own business has definitely been a steep learning curve, but it's something that I'm really enjoying doing because I genuinely feel it's, you know, I found a purpose through doing it.
Yeah, and you feel you're helping people.
Yeah, whether it's individuals, you know, or whether it's businesses as a whole.
And you've mentioned some of the things you speak about when you do your motivational speaking. Do you speak a lot about post-traumatic growth and how trauma can actually and does seem to make some of us stronger?
I don't specifically use those words, but I think that comes through. I talk a lot about mindset and a growth mindset, and now how that has helped me kind of tackle all of the challenges that I've faced. But I suppose the next step is that post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
And that it's challenges don't necessarily have to knock you down and hold you back. They can be the stepping stones to going on and achieving bigger and better things. And that's definitely something I talk about, yeah.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. That was one of the drives for me starting the podcast. I was so fascinated by how a lot of high-performing individuals have achieved these incredible things despite experiencing really significant adversities earlier in their lifetime. So that I started looking into this post-traumatic growth. And I now, similar to what you just said, I'm a real believer that trauma is not what happens to us, but it is how we respond to it. And I would just love to share that message with as many people as possible. But sometimes, and what's really frustrating is people need to kind of go through their difficult moments to realise that, don't they? And when you hear it not having gone through something tricky, it can just bounce off you, I think.
Yeah, because I think when you've gone through it, you know that you can hit rock bottom and claw your way back again, and you learn your strategies for being able to do that. But sometimes it does take actually going through that experience to realise it. But it's definitely true. You know, I mean, Viktor Frankl writes about it, and I know you've read the book as well, but he talks about between stimulus and response, there's a gap, and in that, or a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. And that's so important. And that's what I talk about a lot, is that you can't change what happens. Shit does happen all the time, but what you can have control over and choose is your response to that. And if you give yourself a little bit of time to choose your response, then it's so powerful, and that's where the growth comes from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You've spoken about exercise and what exercise means to you. Any specific other strategies you've used over the years that you think have helped drive you forward?
Yeah, I mean, exercise is definitely a big one. Various kind of mindset tools I use. So I talk about finding your superpower. So in my case, it was, I'm nails, and that's something that kind of kept me going. But everyone's got a superpower. Everyone's different, not better, not worse, just different. And I think if people can kind of, be more in touch with themselves and find that bit of them, their core identity, then that can really help. But also the power of reframing. And this is something I talk about a lot. And when you're facing challenges, you can flip your perspective so easily using reframing. So I talk about, for example, when I was diagnosed with cancer, it would have been understandable to think at that point, why me? Because I've just rode the Atlantic and I'm, relatively young and I'm fit and strong. But actually I thought, well, why not me? For all those reasons, because I've just ridden the Atlantic, because I'm fit and strong, I'm better placed than most people to get through it. And that tiny little word not just completely changes that phrase and enabled me to think about it in a very different way. And you can apply that to so many different situations, whether it's why not me, or I can't do it yet, or any number of different similar kind of approaches using reframing. So I think that's so powerful. But it's also having a really good understanding of your why, what motivates you. And it's not, our goal through the row was to get to Antigua, but that was a goal. It wasn't going to help us necessarily get through the challenges. That was more about our why, and what motivated us was our children. And, visualising our children in Antigua when we finished is something that definitely kept us going throughout. And the reason we did it was to inspire them. So they were our why. And I think if people can understand why they're doing things and why they need to get through, it really does help get through those challenging times.
That must have been an emotional moment, seeing your kids
It was
on the banks of Antigua. You haven't seen them for 40 days. And when you've been through something like that, seeing your family on the other side, how was that?
Oh, it was incredible. And actually, because it was still during COVID times in Antigua, people had to wear masks, even children, outside as well as in. So they were wearing face masks, which kind of covered most of their faces. So actually, it was quite hard to even identify who they were. But I just remember seeing their little faces, and that, there was such a mix of emotions on their faces. There was pride, definitely. they were really emotional, but also I think just maybe a little bit nervous or uncertain about the whole thing because, you know, they hadn't seen Mummy for 40 days and suddenly they were in the centre of this massive kind of cacophony of noise and sound and lights and everything else going on. And I think they were a little bit overwhelmed by it.
I can
but
imagine.
it was wonderful seeing them. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Final question, Felicity. If you could go back in time to when things were at their toughest, what do you wish you could have told yourself back then?
I think I always believed I'd get through it, but told myself that better times will come and there will be opportunities from this. And also told myself how many people I could actually help by going through it myself. Because I don't think you necessarily realise that at the time, how powerful sharing your story can be for other people. And actually having that ability to help people is wonderful. It's a real privilege.
Yeah. Where can people find you if they want to know more?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, Felicity Ashley, or my website, felicityaashley.com.
Lovely. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Like we've kind of been saying over email, our stories are very similar. Yeah. And I even saw on your website, you've got somewhere written, when life gives you lemons. Yes. So it's been really great to chat today and to hear you say some of the things that I do truly believe, and that how going through your challenging time has given you so much strength. And please keep sharing the message, because that's what we both do, share and inspire. But thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been brilliant.
Thanks for listening to that chat with Felicity today. I really feel that our stories massively overlap, so I thoroughly enjoyed hearing Felicity's thoughts. Let me know what you think and tune back in next week for another episode of When Life Gives You Lemons.